This podcast is brought to you by Free Buddhist Audio, the Dharma for your life. Our work is funded entirely by donations from our generous listeners. If you would like to help us keep this free, make a contribution at freebuddhistaudio.com/donate. Thank you, and happy listening.
About a little over 20 years ago, I was living at Madhyamaloka and I organised a meeting of scholars and academics for some reason. And at the end of 2 days of discussions, quite intense, as you can imagine, we had a question and answer session with Bhante. This was at Madhyamaloka. One of the people there asked the following question, which was really in two parts. How should we relate to you, Bhante? And then he suggested two alternatives. Should we relate to you as a repository of answers? Or should we relate to you as a model of investigation and inquiry? Now, that's an academic's question, an academic having a responsibility to, as it were, think things through for themselves rather than taking someone else's responses, and to look at evidence and that sort of thing. So you may or may not think that's a good way of framing the question, but it is a good question, and it's relevant. It was relevant then, and it's perhaps even more relevant now. How should we relate to Bhante? I don't think this is straightforward, because different people in the order have different relationships with Bhante. We can use a term like disciple or discipleship, and that takes us somewhere important. But as Bhante himself acknowledged, it isn't the right term for everyone who actually wants to practice his presentation of the Dharma. And I could talk about this as a theoretical question or a sort of political question within the order. But of course, I'm concerned with this for personal reasons. We all are, whether we feel ourselves to be very strongly in the role of disciple or more strongly in the role of, let's say, skeptic or the true individual as opposed to the conformist, or however we might want to frame that question. So it's an important question for me, and I've gradually realised how important it is for me and has been for many years, even though I didn't quite recognise its importance. How should I relate to Bhante? Which also means, how do I feel about Bhante? And as Sadhaloka mentioned, that is partly complicated because I had a role within the order, within the movement actually, in the communications office of dealing with criticisms. And that was difficult. And it was difficult in my relationship with Bhante. And I just want to mention it now, and I'm going to come back to it later. But that, in fact, whether we're talking about me or talking more generally, those difficulties, and I won't name them, I think we know what I'm talking about, those difficulties have been large issues within the order as a whole. And they won't go away. Even if we want them to go away, even if they go away for us, they haven't gone away in the wider world, in the wider perceptions of Bhante, which is a cause of great sadness for me. These are some of these issues are the things that set me over the last few years on a process of rereading, rethinking, in the end, rediscovering Bhante. And I want to share something of that process with you today. I'm not going to describe it in detail because in a way I think it's sort of my business, how I've thought in one direction and found dead ends and had to go in another direction. I don't suppose that's really anyone else's concern. But it's been challenging. One way to talk about the kind of questions I've been asking is not so much in presenting Bhante, not so much talking about what he said, but asking why he said it. So if we want to talk about Bhante's approach to Dharma practice, we could, for example, talk about the system of Dharma practice, previously known as the system of meditation. Of course, we could do that. We know what the stages are, we know how it's expounded, and we can put it into practice ourselves. But there's another question, which is why did Bhante choose that way of formulating the Dharma path? Is it because that's the best way, in some sort of objective sense? It's the way that everyone ought to look at it. And if only whoever it is that compiled the Pali Canon had thought in those terms themselves, they would have done that. Is that the answer? Why did he choose that way of formulating things rather than something, very simple like Sila Samadhi Prajna or Samatha Vipassana or something more complex like the 10 Nyingma paths into which he, of course, was initiated? Why? Do you see what I mean? It's a different way of thinking and it's a different question to ask. Not just what did he say, but why did he say it? And in answering it, you could take it in all sorts of directions. You could do a sociological analysis. That's not what I'm concerned with. In approaching things in this way, I am searching for analogies or ways of framing what I was doing. And one of them, this makes it a bit odd, literary criticism. In other words, you've got the novel, you've got the text, and but there's themes within it that a good critic will draw out. And having read the criticism, then you see more deeply what the patterns are. And this is relevant to the story I started telling at the beginning, because Bhante's response when he was asked, how should we relate to you, was to say, well, perhaps you could relate to me as a novelist or a poet. Perhaps that's the way to relate to me. And I found that perplexing, because you don't, a relationship with a novelist, however deeply immersed you may become in their work, it doesn't involve commitment. I mean, you don't say, I'm a follower of this poet, but not the others, So is that quite right? I was reflecting on that as I've been working on all this material a few years now. And at some point, actually earlier this year, I remembered that Bhante had in fact written an essay in the late 80s called Literary Criticism, East and West. I'm sure you've all read that. It's published in The Priceless Jewel. And so he wrote on that subject because he was asked to. He was asked to give a paper for a conference. And in the paper, he rather dutifully addresses Indian aesthetics through the concept of rasa. But his heart doesn't really seem to be in that part of it. Then he comes to literary criticism in the West, and he says, well, look, actually, my studies have been focused on Buddhism, and this was a paper for a conference of literary critics. He said, I don't really know very much about literary criticism in the West, but there's something I do know about, which is John Middleton Murray. And he quotes a passage from an essay by Murray called The Definition of Poetry, I think that's what it's called, in a volume called Discoveries, published in 1919. And it's a longish passage, and when I read it, it had such an effect on me. It was just such a compelling effect, because I recognised in it what I'd really been doing in this process of engaging with Bhante. So let me read it to you. There are moments when criticism of a particular kind, the only kind I care for, utterly absorbs me. I feel I am touching a mystery. There is a wall, as it were, of dense, warm darkness before me. A darkness that is secretly alive and thrilling to the sense. This, I like to believe, is the reflection in myself of the darkness that broods over the poet's creative mind. It forms slowly and gradually gathers while I read his work. The sense of mystery deepens and deepens, but the quality of the mystery becomes more plain. There is a moment when, as though unconsciously and out of my control, the deeper rhythm of the poet's work, the rise and fall of the great moods that determined what he was and what he wrote, enter into me also. I feel his presence. I am obedient to it. It seems to me as though the breathing of my spirit is at one with his. Wow. For one thing, I found that approach very evocative of how Bhante himself approaches Buddhist texts, and perhaps you could even say approaches the Buddhist tradition. What's he doing when he reads the Lotus Sutra or the Sutra of Golden Light? He's not expounding it in traditional terms. He's not analysing it. Nagapriya, in his, where is he? In his excellent book about the Lotus Sutra and Pure Land teachings, mentions this, and he uses the term palimpsestic reading. He says that Bhante engages in palimpsestic reading a text like the Lotus Sutra as if it were a palimpsest, a clue to a deeper meaning which is between the lines, between the words, or beyond them somehow, on some other level. That's a whole talk in itself, isn't it? Not one I'm going to give right now. It also describes my experience of engaging with Bhante. It's been a very strange process indeed. The strangest writing experience I've ever had, and one of the perhaps actually the strangest experience of all. I thought I was writing one thing, which in a way was quite rational, and I've ended up writing something completely different, which I'm going to sort of evoke for you. And it's not because I particularly want to. It's because I can't really seem to do anything else. It's deeply inconvenient for me to be involved in this process. I cannot tell you how inconvenient it is. I need to earn a living, and I need to write this book. So let me take you on that sort of imaginative journey. Imagine it. Imagine Bhante. Think of Bhante Sangharakshita, whatever your response may be to him. Think perhaps of those volumes of grey, thick, collected works that line up on your bookshelf, or they should, or perhaps just on the centre library, rebuking you for all the reading you haven't done. Bhante. Let's get beyond that. That's part of the wall. To our connection. Perhaps the connection at our ordination. You may or may not have felt it was a connection to Bhante, but it was a connection to the three jewels, and actually it was a connection to Bhante whether you knew it or not. Imagine it. Imagine the wall of dense, warm darkness. A darkness that is secretly alive and thrilling to the sense. Feel it. The darkness which broods over Bante's creative mind. The sense of mystery. And the moment when a deeper rhythm appears. Boom, 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 boom. And we arrive, if you follow me, in a room. It's an average-sized room. It's light. In fact, there's a wall of windows down one side. Beyond the wall is a veranda, and beyond that veranda is a deep valley sloping down to a jade-green river. On the other side of the valley is a great range of Himalayan foothills. Beyond them, a range of snow-capped mountains, and because this is autumn, the sky is clear and Mount Kanchenjunga appears silhouetted against it, shining and brilliant. Inside the room are two men. Sangharakshita, aged 37, at the prime of one phase of his life, and Kachu Rimpoche. It's the 21st and will stay here till the 22nd of October 1962. Outside the room, in the world beyond Kalimpong, the world is not at peace. This is day 2 of the Chinese invasion of India that we call the Sino-Indian War. Chinese troops had come across the border, just the other side of Bhutan, just a couple of 100 miles away, all along the McMahon line and also in Ladakh. It's day 6 on the 21st and day 7 on the 22nd of October 1962 of the 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis. On the second of these days, President John F. Kennedy goes on television, on all of the American networks, and declares that there will be a blockade of Russian ships sailing towards Cuba. And the world holds its breath, fearing a nuclear war. Bantes may not know about any of this. Something else is happening in this room. This is the Padmasambhava Abisheka. The room itself, maybe we can just dwell on that. We have a couple of descriptions. A gangly 29-year-old English Shramanera is staying at the Vihara. He will later be known as Bhikkhu Kantipalo. And in his memoir, Noble Friendship, he describes the shrine room in this way. When we closed the door to the veranda, few sounds could be heard. Maybe muted bird song, if it was light enough, or sounds of foot soldiers to the nearest village. But within the room, there was an indescribable natural silence. And though it was an ordinary enough small room, within it was a presence, a sort of shiningness, hard to put into words. Bante himself wrote a report about the Vihara the following year, 1963, and he described the shrine room in these terms. As the sun sets behind the blue Darjeeling hills, its last rays slanting down across the valley and in at the shrine door, set ablaze the silver and brass altar utensils, and softly light up the smiling gilded face of the standing Buddha image occupying the place of honour on the topmost tier. We're in the shrine room, and over these 2 days, Kachu Rimpoche, Bante's friend, but now in the role of Vajraguru, conducts the Padmasambhava Abisheka and then gives Bante, inducts him into the Mula Yogas. And something happens. Something happens. And if we raise our gaze above the shrine to the ceiling, which both is and isn't there, we see what's happened. It's Padmasambhava in my imagination. It's Padmasambhava blazing with light, with Vajra power. And Bante's connected with him through Kachu Rimpoche. And behind Kachu Rinpoche is his teacher, Jamyang Khyentse Rinpoche. And this is a space outside of time. And perhaps it's the space of my own private ordination. Perhaps it's a space that Subhuti described in a talk this summer of his private ordination, which he said was outside time and was continuing as if it never ended. Perhaps it's your ordination space. So something happens and it changes Bante. It changes Bante in ways that we perhaps underestimate. Whether this change can be entirely identified with this particular initiation, I don't know. That's the story I'm telling today, and no doubt other stories could be told. But what is that change? At this point in Bante's life, he's a highly respected bhikkhu. Even though he's got a very, what should we say, unconventional, non-denominational approach to the Dharma, he's very respected. Kachu Rinpoche doesn't mind that he's wearing Theravadan monks rather than having been ordained into a Nyingma order. He doesn't mind about that. No one minds about that, from what I can tell. He edits magazines, he speaks around India, he's beloved by the followers of Dr. Ambedkar. He's respected in England, so much so that when they fall out, the English Buddhists, they think that he will be the solution. In fact, he became their biggest problem. And all of that, the somewhat scholarly books that he's writing at the moment, he's intending to write a series of 5 volumes called The Heritage of Buddhism, of which 3 Jewels is the first and the Eternal Legacy is the second, and he's going to be a scholar monk. That's what he's got in his mind. Yes, he'll be very active around India. Something happens. What? So, there are 3 headings. I'm just going to give you the headings, and then I want to continue this journey to describe what they mean. So, I suggest that what Padmasambhava meant for Bante was, firstly, something to do with contacting the depths, the irrational depths, which raises the question, what lay in Sangharakshita's irrational depths? Secondly, it's connected with the way he speaks about vision and transformation. Padmasambhava, to summarise, initiates the path of transformation, in one sense. And thirdly, it's associated with what he talks about again and again as a stream of spiritual energy. Padmasambhava represents that stream of energy, and let's see how that manifests in his life. So, it's 1972. We're in Pundarika. We're in a renovated piano factory in the room above, in the upstairs room, in a semi-derelict area of London, surrounded by squats. The squats are full of disreputable, hairy no-goods, and Buddhists. Bhante stands to give a talk, proud at this new movement he's founded. Even though the previous year, Buddhadasa had come across this new movement and found that the order of which Bhante spoke so highly really only included maybe 3 or 4 active members. But something is happening, and it's attracting these young people, despite Bhante's greasy hair and bad teeth and weird diction. He's wearing robes, but over civilian clothes. He's sexually active. He's been cast out by the Buddhist establishment. Actually, that's rhetoric, isn't it? They just don't like him. They don't want him around. They think he's trouble. He is trouble. If, in talk after talk that Bhante gives in the whole period from his return to England, from 1964, there's a certain theme, and I'm going to give a few plugs to books. I've already done Nagapriya's. Excellent book, Nagapriya. Buy that book. But one of the recent volumes of collected works includes Bhante's uncollected complete works, includes Bhante's uncollected essays, lectures from this period. And reading it through, what you find is, again and again, the theme is, you must contact the depths. We must find emotional equivalents of our intellectual understandings. We need myth. We need ritual. We need puja. And it's easy to listen to those talks or read them and to assume that Bhante's talking to these rather alienated people at the Hampstead Buddhist Vihara, or perhaps the young hippies who are hungry for magic. And no doubt that's true. But there's something else as well, which I've learned, this isn't perhaps another bit of palimpsestic reading, that when Bhante speaks about the need to contact the depths, he's doing it because that's what's alive for him. He's talking to other people, and maybe he's talking to us, but he's talking about himself. He's talking about what's alive for him. He is in a process of contacting his depths, and when he describes the Buddha confronting Mara, or being wrapped by the coils of Muchalinda, or Nagarjuna, being given the perfect wisdom texts by the Nagas, he's speaking about a process in which he is involved. When in this talk that he's giving, as he stands here in Pundarika, he says, it's not enough to appeal just to the rational mind. One must appeal also to the unconscious depths. It's not enough just to read books on Buddhism, to listen to lectures. One must also meditate. One must plumb the depths within oneself. One must chant, perform pujas, engage in symbolical ritual. It's not enough just to think, even to think about Buddhism. One must feel. One must respond with one's whole being. So that's Bhante's, that's a quote from the talk, and it's a talk about Padmasambhava. It's one of 2 talks that he gave after his return to the West. But it's a message he's been giving again and again, and it raises the question, if Bhante felt the need to contact the depths, if that was what was alive in his spiritual life, and if that had started, let's say, with the Padmasambhava Abisheka, what was in those depths? Well, let's go back to a poem from the early 50s, a poem, and of course Bhante said that his poems were his secret autobiography. So if we want to trace the deeper rhythms of Bhante's life, the poems are important. It's called Goldfish. It goes like this. The first two stanzas go like this. In the dim green stillness of the pool, there is a redness as of gold. He's looking at a pool and he's seeing goldfish in it. Flashing among the dark brown weeds, glimmer on glimmer, bright but cold, of the black-finned goldfish, beautiful, that breathe down there where the lotus breeds. Deep in the ocean of my soul flickers an anguish, red as fire, twining among my oozy thoughts, glimmer on glimmer of hot desire, leaping and sparkling beyond control in the darkness where the heart contorts. Oh. I think we get the message. Something very sexual going on in Bhante's depths. So is it a surprise that having this stream of powerful Vajra-like spiritual energy pouring through him from the Padmasambhava Abisheka and continuing to pour through him as he returned to England, that everything changed, that what was in the depths had to come out, and that he became sexually active with whoever was around, and it would be with men. The goldfish are hiding because otherwise they'll be caught. Homosexual in that period had to hide, and this is what the rest of the poem actually says, because otherwise the world would turn on them. Let's jump ahead. Get into the TARDIS, through the space-time continuum. We get out. It's 1979. We're in the shrine room of the London Buddhist Centre. It's only been open for 8 months. Bhante, the previous time Bhante was there, he performed a dedication ceremony. Since then, he's been to India and been, the first time he's been back for whatever it is, 12, 13 years, and been embraced by large crowds. Bhante is back. Lokamitra and Padmavajra, I think is here somewhere, have been preparing the ground. And he felt that he could pick up where he'd left off, and that he'd actually been elevated to a kind of mythic status, a legendary status among the Indians. It's different, actually, in some ways easier. Then he went to New Zealand. He's given a series of lectures that are eventually published as New Currents in Western Buddhism. The LBC is a statement. It's not just a Buddhist centre. It's not just a shrine room, however beautiful it might be. That large, perhaps over-large Buddha image, it owes as much to Greek statuary as to Indian rupas. The whole place feels modern. It feels vibrant. And it's saying something to anyone who walks into it. And what it's saying is, this isn't Buddhism imported from Asia, imported into the West. This isn't Westerners engaging in a little bit of Buddhism. This is Western Buddhism. It's arrived, it's here, and it has a message for the world. And this Western Buddhism is manifesting as a new society, and 40 people are living in communities, working together. This is a new society. This is something the world has never seen before. And I, Sangharakshita, am at the heart of it. His talk is on the Manu, the Buddha, the Guru, and the Tirtan. And so Padmasambhava is going to come into the talk. I believe Spooty mentioned this yesterday. He says to his listeners, you've got to descend into the flames to be transformed. So he's speaking about that same process that he's mentioned before. But there's something new. There's more distinction. When he comes to speak of... he speaks of these four figures. The Manu is, first of all, the lawgiver. In some ways, it's rather unfortunate, because in India, Manu is associated with the Manusmriti, the caste system. But his example is of Baba Saheb Ambedkar, a new Manu who dispenses with the Manusmriti and holds up the constitution. That he's the new lawgiver, and how sad it is to see that under threat. Then there's the Buddha. And Bhante says of the Buddha that the Buddha is, of course we know who the Buddha is, we know what he did, but he says that the Buddha taught the Dharma, he revealed the Dharma, but he did so in quite general terms. In principial terms, in rather abstract terms, and you see that when you read the discourses. Something else is needed, and that's the Guru, the archetypal Guru being Padmasambhava. What Padmasambhava represents is applying the Buddha's teachings, making it alive in the depths of the culture that he inhabits. Not that no one had ever done that before Padmasambhava, but that's what Padmasambhava represents. And Bhante's been saying in talk after talk, that's what we have to do. We have to take the Dharma into the depths, not just of our psyches, but of the culture. And then we have the fourth, lost track. Then, yes, the fourth of these figures, the Triratna, the one who discovers the termas. And Bhante says of the Triratna that he makes that process of renewal, the process of engaging the Dharma with the depths needs to be renewed. And that's what the Triratna does. Padmasambhava, let me read you a little bit of what he says, just to make that a little bit clearer. The Buddha proclaims the teaching in a general way, and Padmasambhava causes it to penetrate into the depths of the psyche, to transform the archetypes of the collective unconscious. But even he can't do it once and for all. Circumstances change, and new versions of the teaching need to be adapted to new circumstances. This is what the termas represent. The transforming principle adapted to specific circumstances in the here and now. Inspirations which come to us for our guidance in accordance with the general principles of the teaching in both its visionary and its transforming aspects. Inspirations, the transforming principle. Padmasambhava represents for Bhante the path of transformation. And I sometimes wonder if we could even think of the whole of Bhante's life up to his return to England, or perhaps up to the Abhisheka, as a period of the path of vision. But something changes, and he has to enter another phase, the path of transformation. And something hangs over this. It hangs over this list of figures. And that is a suggestion that Bhante is performing the role of Triratna. He's not Padmasambhava, perhaps, but he's renewing what Padmasambhava did in this circumstance, in these situations. And if we want an image for that, perhaps we need to move ahead a couple of years to his engagement with Saint Jerome. And he says of the image of Saint Jerome, who is also an image, of course, of Bhante himself, of the man as interpreter and creator, bringing up into consciousness what he has experienced in the depths of his own being and giving it appropriate expression for the benefit of all. A spiritual being who in the shadow of time and death strives to fathom the mystery of existence. Someone who later became chair of the LBC said Bhante had taken him aside around this period and said, "It's not just a matter of nice jobs for nice people." He speaks of the FWBO as a stream of spiritual energy. He speaks of Padmasambhava as a stream of spiritual energy. And he says, if you touch that stream, like touching an electric current, you might get a shock. Deep breath. There's something else. As Sadhaloka said, I was 14 years old when I first encountered the FWBO at Aryatara, in fact, not at Croydon. And something happened to me, which maybe has happened to you, and I find it hard to describe what that was, except to say that I felt that I touched a current of spiritual energy. And it changed my life in ways you sort of take these things for granted, but I now start to see how significant it was. But this was the Croydon Buddhist Centre in the 1980s. And it was very inspired, and there was a current of energy running through it all the time, right up to the end. Only it wasn't entirely spiritual energy. It was energy that was mixed with all sorts of complicated things, which many of us had endless discussions trying to understand. And actually people got hurt, including me. And we can't leave that out of it. And in quite important ways, some of the people who were responsible for that were very devoted to Bhante, and felt that they were putting into practice this stream of spiritual energy. They were giving it a form. And there are other voices. In this story that I've given, this account of Bhante's life and career that I've given, I've tried to do justice to a compelling voice, to a really important dimension, the sense in which Bhante was in touch with a greater transcendental force, and the sense in which I can be in touch with that through him. But that's not the only voice. There were other voices of these people who touched the current of spiritual energy and got a shock, as Bhante warned, and still had that, and have their stories to tell about that, and insist on telling those stories. I started by, and actually those stories have drowned out Bhante's own voice in the wider world, beyond the charmed circle of our order and movement. Bhante can't get a hearing because of those voices. In 2002, I was taking a break in my work for the movement, and I went to I found myself on doing a solitary retreat for a month in a monastery that was holy to Padmasambhava in Bhutan called Chimpunye. It's one of 3 monasteries where Padmasambhava is said to have stayed in his after he left Tibet. He stayed in 3 places in Bhutan. And the monastery perches beside a stream that plunges into a deep gorge. You can go down into that gorge, and all around the edge of the gorge is a path. There are little kind of, even calling them kutas is too much, little sort of brick alcoves where people would do retreats. There's a great waterfall pouring down, and the whole gorge, the whole valley echoed, resonated with falling water. Constantly, for 4 weeks. And in these walls, which were limestone, the rock was limestone, were deep crevasses. And the place was associated with dharmas. And I placed my hand in one of the crevasses and grabbed nothing, empty air. But you could imagine that one day you would go back and you would feel parchment. And it would be a teaching, a literal teaching, maybe a metaphor for the mind dharmas that appear in different ways. But I didn't touch a parchment. I was there in the most romantic, idyllic place to have a solitary retreat that you could imagine. And I'm the only Westerner, so far as I'm aware, who has ever done that. At least I was at the time. Let me be famous for doing that. But no, I felt like I was a tourist. I felt a fraud. It was a nice place to be a tourist, but when I meditated, there was a block. And I found myself in remote Bhutan in the Middle Ages, but thinking about what I was going to be doing when I left, which was to go back to Madhyamaloka to start working for the movement again, which I didn't want to do, but couldn't somehow get out of. And the reason, underneath it all, why I didn't want to work for the movement and eventually stopped, was that I'd been that person in the communications office 25 years ago, to the day almost, when the phone rang and it was Madeleine Bunting on the other end, and a whole new phase of the perceptions of the movement started. But that wasn't the problem. The problem was that we couldn't be open and honest and fully truthful about the issues that were being touched on. We could talk about Croydon, blame those people, that was easy. We could talk about, deconstruct whether the suggestions that Triratna wasn't a legitimate Buddhist movement, but we couldn't talk about Bhante. There were all sorts of reasons for that, and actually there were quite legitimate reasons. I won't go into them all now, but I will mention that underneath a lot of those reasons was the fact that we were there as spokespeople for Bhante. So how could we speak up in a way that was critical of Bhante if Bhante wasn't doing it himself? We couldn't. We were stuck. And I didn't like it. On a deep level, I felt compromised. I was criticised for what I had to do. I did my best, and I've continued to do my best. I will always stand up for Bhante. This process was only resolved for me a couple of years ago. I won't go through all the ins and outs, but the process really focused on the Adhisthana Kula report. As you know, that was a report that went into all of the details of Bhante and his experience and his history. And I was involved, I wasn't a part of the Adhisthana Kula, but I was involved in in the process of writing up their findings. And that report has a section on our relation to Bhante, back to the question it started with. And it says this: taken together, these points show the complexity of Sangharakshita's place in Triratna, which is likely to remain in years to come. We believe it's important to recognise that complexity, neither dismissing the problems nor reducing their importance. Triratna's future will be worked out in relation to Sangharakshita in all his complexity and his mixed impact on others. Beside his limitations, flaws, errors, and the harm experienced by some, we set the inspiration, brilliance, and depth of his teachings, the memory of his kindness, and his legacy as a founder. I know how painful some order members found that document to have been. I know that some people didn't want it to be written or written in that way. I know that that is a source of tensions between us. I know some people want to dismiss or rewrite or something what was produced there. But let me tell you the effect it had on me. It made it possible for me to see Bhante as the Vajra Guru that I believe he is. That may be surprising to you, but that's what happened. When I think of that scene in the shrine room, and in some phases in my meditation, I actually can't think of anything else. I feel Padmasambhava with his blazing Vajra energy. I feel Bhante absorbing it and making it afresh. I feel myself in relation to that. And that wouldn't have been possible. It wasn't possible for me for many, many years. For many years, when I thought of Bhante in meditation, I just started thinking about all of these issues. I couldn't remotely do something like the Kalyana Mitra Yoga or the Guru Yoga. But my meditation has turned into the Guru Yoga. I mean, the traditional Nyingma one. It just happened. Isn't that strange? Isn't it all so strange? But that's the process through which I've been travelling, with which I'm sharing with you today, and which I'm trying to turn into a book, although who knows when I'll actually manage to do that. And it's a process that is evoked by John Middleton Murray. I'm going to finish with a final passage from the same essay. Then we know him indeed with a knowledge that time cannot diminish. We have lived with him, but with him impersonally, what he was, not with what he appeared to be. All that we can do, if we are by nature foreordained to this particular form of wrestling with the ineffable, is to try to make partially explicit this knowledge that we have. To try, if we are critics, to show where the temporal garment is thinnest and sits closest to that which is beneath. To indicate the moments when the motion is most visible. To follow out in the very structure and detail of the work the secret pattern to which we hold the key.
We hope you enjoyed this week's podcast. Please help us keep this free. Make a contribution at freebuddhistaudio.com/donate. And thank you